Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, murder live streamed on TikTok.
Shock and heartbreak on social media tonight after a popular 23-year-old TikToker from Mexico was shot and killed while live streaming. Valeria Marquez could be seen collapsing on camera.
The video spread fast, and now it's being investigated as femicide, highlighting a reality women in Latin America have lived with for years. I'm Manuel Rápalo, and this is The Take.
My name is Julia Galiano. I am a freelance journalist based in Mexico City and often collaborator with Al Jazeera English.
Julia, welcome back to The Take. Social media has been flooded recently with a disturbing video of a Mexican influencer, Valeria Marquez, who was shot dead while doing a live stream on TikTok from the beauty salon where she worked at in Jalisco, Mexico. What more can you tell us about this case, and why did it strike such a nerve?
Well, I mean, I think that the reason why it's become viral and, it's because of how it happened. It's very Hollywood-esque in some way. Like, here's this woman talking to the camera and live on, she has something like 100,000 followers. And we hear, somebody coming into her salon and asking if it was her. Is it Vale? And she responds, yes, mutes the camera. Presumably thinking she's going to have a conversation with this person. And then the next thing we see is her kind of clutching her stomach after she's been shot. So I think it's the reason why it's blown up in the way that it has. It's kind of like the ultimate thing that you can see, it's a live murder happening, in front of your screen. So unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that probably happens a lot more, obviously not in, happens a lot in Mexico, not in this way. And probably those cases don't end up having the same amount of notoriety and having entire, programs or articles written about it. But in this case, absolutely, I think it has to do with how it played out and the fact that it was live on social media.
No, it's certainly a shocking video. According to a statement by the Jalisco prosecutor's office, this case will be investigated as a femicide in Mexico, which is a term that carries very specific connotations in Mexico. It evokes very specific legal and socio-political connotations. That is, there's been a lot of speculation as to why Valeria was killed. Some people believe it may have been linked to organized crime. Others are saying femicide. How this case is classified will determine how it's investigated. This is the reason that we're asking this. But before we go on, can you tell us what exactly is femicide and how it's defined in Mexico?
The Mexican law defines femicide as a crime against somebody because of their gender. In this case, obviously, because of being a woman. Of course, there is usually there's certain things that lead up to a femicide often, which is, prior violence against a woman, sexual violence, beating. It usually doesn't happen as an isolated thing where you just, killed one day. In the case of Mexico, certainly, there's usually been reports filed before police. There's been threats made that often have been ignored, and like the women haven't been listened to when they say that they're under risk. They're at risk of being killed. But of course, as with most things in the law, there's a lot of room for interpretation, and there's very well-known cases in Mexico of judges not considering something or a case or a person to be at risk of femicide, and then that person going on to be killed in what is, a textbook case of femicide. So I think because of that, there's been a lot of push in Mexico to have that written into law. The problem with Mexico, and analysts that we speak to all the time here say, is that it's not necessarily a problem with the law. The law is there. It's the application of the law and the enforcement of the law, and that is often up to local prosecutors and local judges who, for a variety of reasons, often having to do with corruption and disinterest and being overwhelmed and like not being paid enough. I mean, there's a long list of reasons specifically when it comes to Mexico.
The question of impunity certainly is a big one. I think the bottom line with femicides is that it's not just a regular random crime. It is a gender-based hate crime. And in Mexico specifically, it's sort of the country that helped redefine the term to go beyond just a gender-based hate crime, but also to apply these other connotations. The idea that femicide has to do with impunity, with complicity by the state, with the social normalization of gender-based violence, essentially. I want to read you a quote from Marcela Lagarde. This is a Mexican anthropologist who helped coin and popularize the term feminicidio, which is how it's translated in Spanish, right? She says, quote, "Feminicidio is a crime of the state. It happens when the government fails to guarantee women's lives and freedom, when it allows their murders to go unpunished." And I found this interesting. The reason that I bring this up, because I was also a reporter for many years in Mexico City, like you are. And as an outsider, because I'm not Mexican, but I'd heard the term before, I didn't realize how loaded of a term it is in Mexico, where it takes on a completely different tone than maybe you'd hear in other countries.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think certainly for me, this is where I've become familiarized with the term as well. And I think there's different levels to it. On one hand, you have, life in Mexican society in general, where as a woman, even though I have to say I haven't been personally the victim of violence, you do feel in general a sense of the idea that men, feel this ownership on some level over women. I mean, it's referred to as machismo culture, but it's just a general sense of very entrenched gender roles in which, at the very basic level, there may not be criminal intent there, but when that kind of escalates, that's how it ends up. Most of the femicides in Mexico happen by a woman's either current partner or former partner. So it's definitely an issue you feel just kind of like living in Mexico, like the potential of there being violence against you, the vulnerability of there being violence against you as a woman. And what you're saying about impunity in that quote that you read, I mean, that is really what is at the heart of it.
Can you talk about how that broader failure to deliver justice in cases of femicide specifically, what kind of response do you think that we're actually seeing from the justice system in Mexico?
I remember we interviewed this woman who had been stabbed dozens of times by her former partner. She barely missed being killed. This had been something like a decade before. And she brought us into her house and she showed us this like massive file of paperwork. She was still in the process of getting some sort of justice, which she was having to basically continue to push for herself. She had received no support on one hand from the judicial authorities, and on the other, oftentimes women are re-victimized when they go to the authorities by like, oh, what were you doing with that man? Or what did he do? What did you do to anger him? I mean, questions that when you hear them, you're just like, how can an authority be saying that to somebody who's visibly, I mean, this woman was hospitalized for her injury.
It's something about these cases as well. It's the level of violence, the sort of grotesque nature oftentimes that's associated with the way that women are killed. And I want to point out that after just a few days after the killing of Valeria Marquez in Mexico, there was another murder, a model and influencer named Maria Jose Estupiñán, who was shot dead in her home in Colombia. And I mentioned this because Latin America has one of the highest femicide rates as a region in the entire world. That case in Colombia is also being investigated as a femicide. Can you walk us through a little bit of the history here? When did femicide start making headlines in Latin America?
I think over the last, 20 years, and in Mexico specifically, over the last 10, I think it's when the movement has really gained some traction. And there's the Ni Una Menos, a movement that was born in Argentina and that has grown all over the region, not basically referring to not one more woman being killed. So yeah, I think definitely it has been over the last decade that it has really kind of grown and kind of the definition and like the word you hear it more kind of in the street, people referring to this type of crime as femicide. And I think, it in part has to do with social media because a lot of these cases have become much more visual. The videos have been widely spread. and it's given more people an opportunity to kind of like see it firsthand, whereas like before it would be something that happened and that maybe like, you know, locally people knew about, and it was like covered in the media in a very kind of you know, passing way, but it, you know, it wasn't focused as much. I think increasingly whenever something like this happens in Mexico now, and again, whenever a case happens that becomes publicly known in the way that this case has just now, you know, you do get all the media and interviews and live coverage of people talking about what it is, you know, that femicide entails, and, you know, what the country's doing to tackle it.
It kind of reminds me of covering the case of Devani Escobar in 2002 in Mexico. This is a femicide that took place in Monterrey, where it was in the news way after the body of this young woman, an 18-year-old young lady in Monterrey, Mexico. After her body was found, this was still being discussed. This was still on the news. It was still being debated. And that name, Devani Escobar, is still, I think, a household name in Mexico today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it'll probably happen with this latest case as well. It eventually will fall off the headlines, and then will go back to, you know, living normally until another case happens, because it doesn't, up to this point, none of this has translated into any kind of meaningful action or legislation in the part, and you know, from the government to kind of take steps to stop it. And men are, you know, the men that are perpetrating these crimes, they also understand that the authorities are to some degree on their side, because they're not really paying attention to the complaints and the accusations that the potential victims in this case are making.
More with Julia after the break. So, Julia, I want to talk about the public reaction to femicide in Mexico. We've seen over the years massive demonstrations. Some of the largest marches and demonstrations that I've seen personally in Mexico have been led by these feminist movements. Certainly the International Women's Day March is the largest one that takes place every year in Mexico, demanding justice for women who have been murdered or disappeared in Mexico. These feminist movements have become a powerful symbol of resistance, but have they led to any meaningful change?
I think that by their own, you know, if you ask them this, they would agree with what I'm about to say, which is no. I mean, the statistics don't show any kind of decrease in the number of women that are being killed in Mexico, or, you know, the number of people that are being tried for killing women. So I think in general, there's a very palpable sense of disappointment in the movement here. And again, that brings us back to an issue that we've kind of flirted with during this conversation, which is the election of a woman president here, which I think, you know, when I covered the march last March, not this March that just passed, but 2024, I remember asking people in that march if they believe that having a woman elected president of Mexico would change things. And to be fair to the movement, even back then, a lot of people said, look, we'll see. But so far, nothing she's said, you know, leads us to believe that this is somehow going to be a radical change from what we have now.
This is what she had to say about the murder of Valeria Marquez.
Se está trabajando con
We are working to find those responsible and determine the motive behind this situation. Obviously, we express our solidarity with the family during this unfortunate situation. The Security Cabinet is working in coordination with the prosecutor's office.
You sort of already started touching on this, but are things different under President Sheinbaum?
I think, tangibly speaking, in terms of facts, things haven't changed. The numbers certainly don't show that the number of people being killed or the number of people being prosecuted for killing them, it has gone down in the time that she's been president. I think maybe her way of addressing the public is maybe a bit more nuanced than what her predecessor was, but ideologically, I think there, you know, she was elected basically as his chosen candidate, and a lot of the programs that were under the prior administration, which people actually also had a lot of hope for, because Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the prior president, also ran on a platform of change. And, but the bottom line is that I don't think things have changed. And I don't think that the feminist movement here and women activists think that things have changed. And there is a sense of disappointment with that because of the fact that she is a woman and that, she's a mother. And, you see a lot of that in these massive marches every year, signs that speak specifically to her, saying, think about this happening to your daughter. And, we definitely saw a lot of that in the march this year.
You mentioned one distinction is maybe the nuance in the rhetoric that we're hearing from Mexico's new president. I know that President López Obrador, Claudia Sheinbaum's predecessor, was heavily criticized for avoiding even using the term femicide and would often downplay the severity of the crisis itself in Mexico. I remember one press conference where López Obrador said that there was one case in particular of femicide where he said that it was politically motivated.
El 90% de esas llamadas
90% of those emergency calls you're using as a reference are false.
Está demostrado.
It's been proven.
Y esto no es solo por tratarse.
And this isn't just because they have to do with the mistreatment of women.
Esto sucede lo mismo en las llamadas.
The same thing happens with the calls the metro receives about sabotage or bombs.
Sabotajes. Sobre bombas.
One of the things that really got him in hot water at times was that he was very critical of the feminist movement in the context of these marches, because there are groups in these marches that do turn violent. There's a lot of graffiti, and there's breaking of facades of businesses and so forth. And he was extremely critical of that in his morning press conference. And basically the feminist movement said, you never talk about us, you never address our concerns, our demands, but when you do bring us up, it's in the context of us being violent, of us being angry, and it's just kind of perpetuating and fostering this idea for the rest of society that, women are just crazy, angry, and, making a show, and what are they doing this for? This is not the way to do it. The argument of women, it's just what other tools do we have? We've been screaming for attention to what's happening. We're literally being killed. We're going out and not coming home to our families. What other tools do we have to let this society know what's happening to us?
Are there any solutions on the horizon? Anything that we can point to, or ideas that are being floated around in Mexico to fix this problem?
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. The fact that there are no, as far as I know, big kind of solutions being presented beyond the law is there and it needs to be applied. But for that, there needs to be an entire restructuring of the legal and judicial system. I remember one of the stories I covered here last year was this group that met here in Mexico City, and it was basically a group of men that would meet to they had it wasn't mandatory necessarily, it was by choice, but they had violent flare-ups against women in their lives. And this kind of NGO kind of brought them together. Sometimes it was actually court-ordered, now that I remembered. Brought them together to talk about what had led them to react violently to their partner, or maybe their sister or their mother, or a woman in their lives, or a coworker. I mean, it's just... And it was really interesting because it was the first time that I saw a sense of, ownership from men. Maybe that's the way. Maybe it's about, this happening on a larger scale and across the country, and kind of, a re-education of men, a men's kind of sense of ownership and of power and of control over women, and how that manifests itself. But of course, that's not an easy solution. That's not something that's going to happen. We're talking generationally, right?
There's so much nuance to this problem, but I think you're right. I think what this requires is not only about laws and policy, but about cultural changes in our region of the world. Finally, Julia, I want to ask you on a more personal note, because I know that you've covered this topic for a long time. You've reported on these marches in Mexico City. You've attended these marches as a woman As a mother, what hope do you have for this problem being resolved in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. It wasn't a work assignment, but I went to the march this year with my 5-year-old daughter, and I found it interesting that, you know, she's very curious, and she's like constantly asking me what people are chanting, because it's a very energetic march, and there's a lot of chanting and a lot of, and I realized that every 4 out of 5 of the chants that were prominent during this march, I couldn't actually bring myself to repeat to her, to explain to her, to translate to her, because they were speaking about very violent things, and I just felt uncomfortable at 5, explaining to her that women get killed by their partners. And so to me, it was an interesting kind of message, or an interesting reminder rather, of the fact that that really is at the front and center of the issue here, especially when it comes to March 8th, Women's Day. I'm definitely nervous about my daughter growing up here. She's Mexican. She was born in Mexico. And I think about, when she's able to go out on her own and, not be within my constant reach. I'm obviously very fortunate to be in a position where I can say well, maybe, we'll leave and she can grow up somewhere else where she can have what I consider to be a more normal kind of growing up experience, where you can, be with your friends in the street and your parents not be worried that something horrible is going to happen to you. So yeah, not an entirely positive outlook at this stage.
Julia Galiano, thank you very much for joining us today on The Take.
Thanks for having me.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.